We would like to acknowledge the traditional territories of the people of the Treaty 7 region in southern Alberta, which includes the Blackfoot Confederacy, comprising the Siksika, Piikani, and Kainai First Nations, as well as the Tsuut'ina First Nation and the Stoney Nakoda, including the Chiniki, Bearspaw, and Wesley First Nations. The City of Calgary is also home to Métis Nation of Alberta, Region 3.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us this morning or afternoon, depending on where you're calling in from. I'd like to welcome you to a Simpson Center webinar series, part of our policy in agriculture. This one is Work It, Labor and Farming in Canada. I'll just quickly go over the event format and then we'll move through the presentations. It's going to be a fairly straightforward show and tell style webinar where each of our presenters will share a presentation. Preceding each presentation, there will be a brief poll that will appear on your screen, so please select an answer from that. The answers of the polls will be then read live to the presenters so that they get a better idea of who is in the audience and what their awareness of these issues are. I'd also like to thank our sponsors, UFA Cooperative Limited and UFA's Rural Communities Foundation for supporting us in this webinar series that we're putting on today. And we're very excited to have you all here. So the first thing that we're going to go over is the poll. The first poll we have. It will appear on your screen also, and I'll read it out loud just in case. So once those pop up. So in your opinion, is there a labor shortage in Canadian agriculture? With the answers being yes, no, or unsure. I'll give you all a minute to look through that, and then we'll revisit. So not surprisingly, 80% think that yes, there is a labor shortage in Canadian agriculture. Only 3% said no, and a good percent, the remaining reading is unsure. So with that context, I'd like to introduce you to our first speaker, Dr. Edward Dunsworth. He is an assistant professor in history and classical studies at McGill University. He specializes in migration and labor with a particular interest in studying Canada within a global context. His first book, Harvesting Labor, Tobacco and the Global Making of Canada's Agricultural Workforce, is set to come out in 2022, this year, with McGill Queen's University's Press for its series, Rethinking Canada in the World. It uses a case study of farm labor in southwestern Ontario's tobacco sector to advance a significant reinterpretation of the histories of farm labor and temporary foreign worker programs in Canada. With that, I'll pass the mic and the camera to Dr. Dunsworth. Thank you.
Thanks so much, John, and also to Christine for inviting me and for organizing. Let me get my PowerPoint up on the screen here. Oh, spoiler alert, there's going to be some graphs. Okay. All right. Yeah, so thank you for having me, and it's nice to be here. Nice also to share the stage with you, Beth. I suspect we're going to have some differences in perspective, but I hope that makes for an interesting session today and that it can lead into a robust discussion during the question period. So the popular story that we're told about the origins of temporary foreign labor programs in agriculture and elsewhere is that they're started to resolve labor shortages and that they continue to serve this purpose because Canadians just aren't willing to do farm work. So Ken Forth, who is the president of FARMS, which is the agency that handles administrative questions for the Seasonal Agricultural Workers Program in Ontario, he kind of summed up this received wisdom in a piece in 2019, writing that the program, meaning the Seasonal Agricultural Workers Program, was established in 1966 to respond to a severe shortage of domestic agricultural workers. It continues to serve this same role 52 years later, enabling Ontario farmers to stay in business. Ontario's fruit and vegetable industry wouldn't exist without supplemental seasonal labor from Mexico and the Caribbean. The equation is as simple and as stark as that. No outside help to do the seasonal farm work that Canadians refuse to do, then no fresh local produce on the shelves at your neighborhood grocery store. My talk today and the soon-to-be released book that it's derived from, you should see the cover for on the slide there. Both the book and the talk today use a case study of Ontario's tobacco sector to dispute this received wisdom about the history of guest worker programs in Canadian agriculture. This received wisdom is something that I call the labor shortage narrative. The central claim of my book and of my talk today is that upon close examination, the story that we've been told all along about why temporary foreign farm worker programs exist, the story simply does not hold up. To give a quick outline of my talk, before getting into the labor shortage narrative, I'll just give a bit of a background on my case study of Ontario tobacco and its workforce, and this will be brief due to time. And then I'll talk a bit about how this labor shortage narrative came into existence in tobacco, with some reference as well to the broader agricultural sector, and whose interests this narrative served and continues to serve. Then I'll put forward a more evidence-based account of how Canadian farms came to depend on temporary foreign workers, a story that, as it turns out, has little to do with labor shortages. Though using tobacco as my case study, I will also reference agriculture writ large, or in any event, labor-intensive horticulture. I'll reference that throughout the talk and suggest that many of my findings hold up in this wider context as well, though of course the research is specific to this case study of tobacco. I'll then conclude with some very brief comments about the present day situation. Okay, so just a little bit about the case study, just to situate you. So this area of southwestern Ontario, you can kind of see in between Toronto and Windsor, is Canada's tobacco belt. It was more commonly known as that, through the 1980s, from about the 30s to the 80s. But even to this day, you can find many fields of leafy tobacco plants if you drive through these areas in summertime. The sector emerged really rapidly in the 20s and 30s to meet surging global demand for cigarettes. And by the 1930s, it required 25,000 or more workers each year to bring in the crop. So it was probably, as far as I can tell, the kind of largest destination for migrant farm workers in Canada for a few decades in the mid-20th century. About half of the people that did these jobs were migrants from outside of the region. And tobacco had a really diverse workforce. Most of these migrants for most of the 20th century were from elsewhere in Canada. So there's a large local workforce, and then there were migrants from elsewhere in Ontario, from Quebec, Atlantic Canada, and smaller numbers from elsewhere in the country, but sometimes from even as far as BC, particularly during the Great Depression. Tobacco also had 3 different guest worker programs. So in 1967, the second year of the Caribbean program, the SOP, tobacco began welcoming workers from the Caribbean, but had 2 other programs too that are lesser known. This photo here depicts 2 workers from North Carolina. So there were migrant workers from the tobacco zones of the US who went up to work in Ontario tobacco each summer from the 20s through the 60s. And then there's also a scheme that brought in European work abroad students from Western and Central Europe that started in the 60s and was statistically important really in the 60s and 70s, but kind of continued even into the 90s in small numbers. So I'd love to say more about all these things because I find them all quite interesting, but we'll just leave it at that kind of sketch for now. There's basically not much mystery as to why so many workers from different parts of the world and different parts of Canada came to the tobacco belt each summer. Basically, tobacco paid high wages, not just compared to other types of farms, but often even higher than entry-level industrial jobs. And it also, from the 20s to the 50s, offered working people pretty astounding opportunities at social mobility. So there's at least hundreds of stories of people starting off as farm workers, progressing to sharecroppers, and eventually to farm owners. So between the wages and the opportunities for social mobility, it wasn't that surprising that so many thousands of people went to work in tobacco every summer. So with this bountiful, diverse workforce, including pre-existing guest worker schemes, the actual history of labor in Ontario tobacco does not match the labor shortage narrative at all. Most importantly, tobacco did not experience labor shortages, like ever. And this is true down to the early 1980s. And actually year after year into the late 1970s and early 80s, there were actually surpluses of job seekers in many years. People would stream into the tobacco belt and, inevitably, not inevitably, but in many years, like a week after harvest started, there'd be people left behind in the tobacco towns who were not able to secure a job and were sort of forced to go home empty-handed. And growers in tobacco were actually very slow to employ SOP workers once they got access to the Seasonal Agricultural Workers Program. It wasn't like the SOP was founded and all of a sudden growers switched en masse to Caribbean workers. Not at all, in fact. With tobacco's pre-existing guest worker programs, basically the percentage of the workforce who were guest workers, regardless of what country they were from, was basically steady, within a range of fluctuation from the 40s to the 80s. Didn't really change much with the introduction of the SOP. So eventually, the migrant Canadian workers did stop coming to work in tobacco, but it wasn't because of the adoption of the SOP. Actually, Canadians really stopped coming to tobacco a decade or more after the SOP's founding in the late 70s and 80s. And the reason they stopped coming was not that they were replaced by temporary foreign workers or that they had all of a sudden become lazy or disinterested. Instead, it was because of economic challenges that made the business of tobacco farming an ever more difficult proposition, resulting in worsening conditions and lower wages for workers. Canadian migrants then stopped coming to work in tobacco for quite sound material reasons, not because of some innate opposition of Canadians to agricultural work. And they were initially replaced not by guest workers at all, actually, but instead by local workers. Basically, what happened there was mechanization in tobacco made the jobs significantly easier physically. So it enabled growers to hire younger teenagers to do the jobs. So it's actually these local teenagers that first replaced the Canadian migrants who disappeared. Only later did guest workers, SOP workers in this case, come to be employed in bigger numbers. And that wasn't until the late 80s and early 90s, full 2 decades after the program was founded. Oops, skipped ahead there. So tobacco really does not fit this labor shortage narrative that we hear often of how temporary foreign worker programs came to be. But tobacco can tell us something about how this narrative was forged and what work it performed and continues to perform. In the same period that tobacco farmers' profit margins were thinning and the sector was becoming a decidedly less attractive place to work, a small but vocal group of tobacco growers began making ever more insistent claims about the depravity of Canadian migrant workers and the superiority of guest workers. Their attitudes cohered into a fairly consistent set of self-evident truths. Canadian migrants were drunks, drug addicts, and criminally inclined, so the story went. They were unreliable, likely to quit without notice before the end of the harvest. They had poor attitudes and were difficult to work with. And perhaps most importantly, they were not truly interested in farm jobs. An example of that sort of version of events came from a grower who spoke to the Toronto Star in 1971. He said, "I had 2 boys here from New Brunswick this fall who got drunk and refused to work the next day. I had to fire them. In the harvest season, people can't just stop and start like that." Foreign guest workers, on the other hand, came to represent precisely the opposite qualities. They were more reliable, morally upstanding, eager, compliant, and genuinely interested in performing agricultural labor. This was a letter written by a tobacco farming couple to their MP. Gives you an example of that perspective. They wrote, "Offshore Caribbean workers are quiet people that spend their evenings cooking, washing, and cleaning, while transients," that's what Canadian migrants were usually called, "transients are often drunkards, abusive, and even violent, with no respect for our property." These claims mirrored very closely ones that had been made by Ontario fruit and vegetable growers since the 1950s and 60s. especially in the context of lobbying for a West Indian guest worker scheme. I'm going to put these workforce photos back on the screen because I don't really have visuals for this section of the talk, so my apologies. As is often the case with elements of common sense, these truisms about Canadian and foreign workers, they were not pure fancy, of course. There can be no doubt that guest workers were indeed more reliable than their Canadian counterparts, although we might note that the reasons for their reliability probably had a lot to do with the structure of the programs and the terms of their contracts of employment and so on. And while there were no real labor shortages in tobacco, growers did have real labor problems. This, again, was not pure fancy. They experienced high turnover, especially as they depended more and more on young workers, as I mentioned before. These young high school workers, of course, had the annoying habit of returning to school once school started, with little regard for whether the harvest was still going on. So that was a problem, no doubt. But neither of these phenomena really changed the labor picture in tobacco. They didn't force a change to more guest workers. Down to the mid-1980s, guest workers still represented a small portion of the overall labor force. Despite all this, tobacco growers were increasingly complaining of labor shortages during this period. So what was going on here? What explains the seeming contradictions of growers' claims about labor shortages at a time when there were no labor shortages, and about Canadian migrants refusing work at a time when they remained a significant element of the workforce? The answers become clear when we examine two more key characteristics of farmers' rhetoric. The first is that such claims came not from all tobacco farmers, or even a majority of them, but instead from a tiny minority, those who hired guest workers. The second is that these comparisons tended to be voiced, and voiced most emphatically, at very specific moments, namely at times when growers' access to foreign workers was threatened. This was a relatively common occurrence during these years. Growers' rhetoric then is best understood as a narrative, one that was articulated by a small minority of growers and deployed at strategic moments. In constructing this narrative, growers took the self-evident truths of Canadian migrant inferiority and guest worker superiority and forged them into a logical sequence, just like the one we heard from Forth at the outset of this presentation. So that logical sequence went something like this. Canadian migrants' disinterest in and profound unsuitability for farm work were to blame for farm labor shortages, and guest workers represented the solution. Over time, this labor shortage narrative would transition from a strategic message to a dominant understanding of the origins of guest worker schemes. So I want to be clear, I'm not suggesting some sort of grand conspiracy theory here. I do think while this might have started off with some strategic, strategic impulses, over time this has become an element of common sense. It's sort of the obvious truth about the situation that I think most people sincerely believe. This narrative was first deployed to great success by fruit and vegetable growers when they were lobbied successfully for the SOP in the 1960s. It came a little later to tobacco, which is not surprising considering that tobacco was flush with all kinds of labor sources in the 1960s, including two other guest worker programs. But we really see the narrative begin to be deployed in tobacco in the 1970s. And it happens, as I mentioned before, as I hinted before, at times when growers' access to the program is threatened. And this actually happened all the time in the first 2 years of the program. We tend to think of this program as almost a permanent part of Canadian agriculture now, and maybe it is now. But for the first 20 years, civil servants and politicians all the time were either trying to limit the size of the program or talking about canceling it altogether due to things like concerns about the political appearances of bringing in guest workers at times of high unemployment and these types of things. So actually the program was quite precarious, at least for its first 2 decades. At these times when either the size of the program or the program in its entirety were threatened, growers launched campaigns to defend their access to the program. And again, it was the small number of growers who are actually using the program who launched these campaigns. And this is where we see this labor shortage narrative being deployed to great effect during these types of campaigns. And I won't get into any details because of time, but I detail those more extensively in the book. Civil servants readily recognize growers' strategic use of the labor shortage narrative. This kind of thing is all over the archive, the archival record. They also often commented on the poor pay and conditions on many farms, and that perhaps growers wouldn't have quote unquote labor shortages if they offered competitive wages and conditions. These types of comments by civil servants are everywhere in the archive. My findings suggest that the skeptical civil servants were right, and not only in tobacco. Tobacco growers weren't alone in being slow to turn to the SOP. In 1981, for example, which was already the 16th year of the program, there were 34,000 farms in Ontario who had paid workers, but only about 1,000 out of those 34,000 used the SOP, or about 3%. If we zoom into some specific crop sectors, only about 5% of vegetable farms hired SOP workers, 4% of apple orchards. In fact, the crop with the biggest percentage of growers using the SOP was tobacco, where 13% of employers used the program. Obviously, it would be great to have some more granular research into these other crop sectors, but it does all seem a bit odd. If labor shortages were so critical in fruit and vegetable sectors, if crops were rotting in the fields and guest workers represented the only solution, then how was it that a tiny guest worker program, which never accounted for more than 10% of Ontario's waged farm workforce during its first 20 years, how was it that such a small program was able to solve this crisis? The case of tobacco certainly invites us to treat the labor shortage narrative in all these sectors with a reinvigorated skepticism. Okay, so we've poked some pretty big holes in the labor shortage narrative, but we know that growers do eventually switch to temporary foreign workers. So why then do they make that switch? A key part of this involves asking when. It's not as soon as the program comes into existence or even close to it, as I've mentioned. In tobacco, it's in the 1980s that this shift towards SOP first starts occurring. So what's happening in tobacco leading up to the 1980s? In short, a long list of calamities: environmental disasters, soaring interest rates, and of course, growing awareness of the link between smoking and lung cancer, and all the excise taxes on tobacco that come with that, and all of that sort of thing. So with these swirling disasters, they don't end the tobacco sector altogether. Of course, you can still see plenty of tobacco fields in that region to this day. So tobacco isn't killed altogether. Instead, what happens is that small farmers were pushed out of business and the sector consolidated, coming to be dominated by large, heavily capitalized, and heavily mechanized operations. In the graph here, you'll see the number of farms, tobacco farms plummeting. That's the blue line, while the number of tobacco produced per farm increases significantly. It was only in this vastly remade, consolidated tobacco sector that more and more SOP workers began to work in the crop. And why was this? Simply put, it was only large operations, the same ones who could afford expensive machinery and produce at a large enough scale to remain profitable. It was only these large operations who could afford to construct new bunkhouses and advance cash for plane tickets to bring in workers from Mexico and the Caribbean. So the switch to the SOP in tobacco was not fundamentally about labor shortages or the inadequacy of Canadian workers or anything else. It's fundamentally about the economic restructuring of the tobacco sector. Of course, this story was particularly dramatic in tobacco with the collapse in the 1980s, but really the story of consolidation has been basically the same across all Canadian agriculture, if a little less dramatic, and really across agriculture throughout the capitalist world. Just one statistic, people are aware of this phenomenon, but the average cropland per farm in Canada, for example, has increased more than sixfold from 1941 to the present. Over these same years, the number of SOP workers and later temporary foreign workers in other agricultural streams entering Canada skyrocketed, with especially steep climbs coming in the late 1980s, late 90s to 2000s, and 2010s. Interestingly, times when farm consolidation was also surging. We can see SOP workers and all agricultural temporary farm workers on this graph here. I contend, based on my research in tobacco, that these two trends are not coincidence, consolidation being twinned with growth in temporary foreign worker programs. And just so you think I'm not completely on an island here, I'm not the only person who has suggested this. For example, a public policy researcher from the very school hosting this event or involved in hosting this event, the School of Public Policy at U of Calgary, researcher Robert Falconer from that school writes in a 2020 report that, quote, the participation of foreign workers in Canadian food production may have little to do with the displacement of domestic workers in comparison to the consolidation of agriculture. Indeed, by 2018, 68% of temporary foreign workers in agriculture were employed by farms with gross receipts of over 2 million, meaning farms ranked in the top 3% of earners in Canadian agriculture. Of course, consolidation is not the only thing going on here. There's some administrative changes too. I won't get into that. I'm aware I'm coming up against my time here. So this in a nutshell is my kind of evidence-based account for the switch to temporary foreign workers that complicates this labor shortage narrative. To bring things back to the present, I think I'll just briefly say a couple of things. First is that I want to be clear that I'm not making a moral attack on farmers here. Farmers are shrewd, rational business people who, like all such business people, are going to pursue the strategies they see as most likely to produce profit. I do contend, however, that farmers, with cooperation from the government, obviously, I do contend that farmers have created the situation that we find ourselves in, have created this dependency on temporary foreign workers. I'm not suggesting that it's reasonable to simply expect farmers to start offering $25 an hour to attract Canadian workers. It's obviously a highly competitive industry with thin profit margins and fierce competition from foreign produced crops, foreign produced produce that is produced for a much cheaper cost. So obviously any significant change to the state of affairs would need to prominently involve the state. So I'm not making a moral attack on farmers, but I am offering a strong critique of the received wisdom that farmers and their organizations tend to put forward about the labor situation in Canadian agriculture. So I hope my historical approach to this question provides some food for thought and some fodder for discussion. And thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Dunsworth. That was a very robust and well thought out presentation. I appreciate some good discussion following also. So before we move on to the next presentation from Beth Connery, we're going to run just one more quick 1-minute poll. So that'll pop up on your screen, but I'll read it just in case. So in your opinion, do we do in Canada, do we do enough to attract and retain agricultural workers? The answer choices are yes, no, or unsure. If everyone wants to take just a quick moment to respond and see what the results are. Okay, so the results are in. And again, in your opinion, do we do enough to attract and retain agricultural workers in Canada? 6% have said yes, 79% have said no, and unsure takes a 15%. So it appears that there's the perception of a deficit in what we're doing to attract workers in Canada. So next, we have Beth Connery to speak to some of those experiences in a more contemporary perspective on some of this. Beth is a farmer with Connery's Riverdale farms in Manitoba, and she's chair of the Labor Committee for the Fruit and Vegetable Growers of Canada. Welcome, Beth. I'll pass the mic and the camera to you.
Great. Thanks very much, John, for the invitation and a very interesting presentation that I don't have the history of the tobacco industry, But I certainly have some history within the program. So I hope that what I bring to the question is informational to everyone. And I will just see if we can pull up my spreadsheet. And have I got it looking correct here? I think. So as John said, I am the labor chair for the Canadian fruit for the Fruit and Vegetable Growers of Canada. And some of you may be more familiar with our name, the Canadian Horticultural Council, that we just shifted away from last year. Still too many people calling us to ask what to do in their gardens. So we moved on to something that was more descriptive of ourselves. And there we are. And as John said, I'm a Manitoba farmer, and we grow asparagus, strawberries, broccoli, carrots, squash, and pumpkins. We have employed SOP workers here since the 1970s, late in that decade. And we have also used the AgStream and the Manitoba Nominee Program to help some employees immigrate when they wish to and when we were able to, because there's parts to that. But on our farm, everything except for the carrots must be hand harvested, which means we're down to manual work. There is no automation available for the other crops. So that means a lot of labor. And on our farm, approximately 50% of my costs is just labor cost. So any changes in those, we are very sensitive to. And as Ed said, we work on thin margins. And particularly over these COVID periods and in this year, with the way inflation is hitting everything, it makes it very difficult to make things work. And part of what we have to do is make sure that farms stay sustainable and that they will be here next year to grow fruits and vegetables for us. The FVGC is the voice of Canadian fruit and veg farmers. We represent about 14,237 farms, over 120 different types of crops, with a total farm cash receipt of $5.7 billion in 2020. And despite our sector's strong contribution to Canada's economy, about $14 billion of real GDP and 181,000 jobs in 2016, we are constantly struggling to fill a labor gap that threatens the growth and viability of our industry. And most certainly, there are many farms who have not been able to make growth decisions because they could not get labor, whether that was local labor or offshore labor or other types of labor. Decisions are being made on a daily basis that restrict the growth of this industry. Canada's fruit and veg farmers need to have access to a reliable supply of labor to meet their planting, growing, and harvesting needs. And I think one of the differences that has occurred over time is where our labor has come from, because previously it was from our local environment. We had a much more robust rural population. People were happy to do some of these jobs, and that is no longer the case. I suspect that the late 80s timeframe that Ed was talking about is also the timeframe when immigration stopped going to rural Canada and started stopping in the major cities. They just mainly transplanted into Toronto, Vancouver, perhaps Montreal, some of those large cities which still draw the bulk of immigration. Without the required seasonal time-sensitive labor, perishable produce is left to rot in the fields, and this can result in extensive food waste, economic loss, and it affects Canadians who rely on our sector for full-time employment in the packing, storage, marketing, and distribution throughout the year. And even on the front end of that, some people have guys come in, or ladies come in, to transplant. So if it never makes it into the field, it never makes it out of the field. So there's a whole procedure there where we need help. In the Canadian Ag Human Resource Council's 2019 Labour Market Information Study, farmers identified a number of barriers in their ability to hire Canadians. It is evident that these barriers are more acute in Canada's horticulture sector, where 72% of horticultural farmers identified manual labor as a barrier, compared to 54% for ag in general. And 66% identified seasonal nature of work as a barrier, compared to 43% for ag in general. And I totally understand a Canadian worker looking for a full-time year-round job. That only makes sense. That's what they need to live on. But that is not something that we can offer, because we start in April and harvest ends, at least in Manitoba, usually the end of October, and that's where we sit. We have nothing for all those workers to do over the winter. Other factors include the rural location of our operations and the declining population in rural communities. And similar stats apply to our ability to retain workers, because we do have Canadian workers who do come and start with us. But in general, we are a stepping stone. Very often what we are is a good first reference for them to go on and get a better job, which is fine for us. We are happy to have workers who come and work for us and move on. But it means that when it comes time for next year and the season starts again, it means that we have to start over. So there's a constant retraining costs and all of those kinds of things that we have to build into our budgets. In Canadian Hort, 43% of workers are foreign, compared to 17% for the rest of agriculture, and 61% of horticultural farms hire foreign workers, compared to 35% in the rest of agriculture. To go into one of the programs, you have to prove that you are looking for Canadian workers and that you have not been able to fill those positions. It is part of the whole framework for these programs. So the Seasonal Ag Worker Program, or SOP, was developed in 1966 as a means to fill labor needs in Canadian agriculture, particularly in horticulture, which at the time I think tobacco may have been a part of, but it is not a part of our group. And SOP predates all of the other TFW programs, and it has some guardrails on it that the other programs do not. Employers can hire TFWs for a maximum period of 8 months between January 1st and December 15th. And our employees in general are looking to go home. They live in Mexico or the Caribbean, and they are coming up here making a conscious choice to come up and better the lives of their families. And then they want to go home to their families. SOP is critical to Canada's fruit and veg farmers, given the time-sensitive work that revolves around seasonal crop cycles, fluctuating weather conditions, and the handling of perishable product. Today, SOP is built on 2 agreements that Canada has with Mexico and Caribbean nations, Jamaica, Barbados, Trinidad and Tobago, Anguilla and Barbuda, Dominica, Grenada, Montserrat, St. Kitts, Nevis, St. Lucia, and St. Vincent and the Grenadines. Most of the small eastern islands are a part of the Organization of Eastern Caribbean States. So we often are talking about dealing with the OES. Government representatives from each country or group, like the OES, have consular offices in Canada to offer assistance to visiting workers by liaising with employers and the Canadian government. And I know that ourselves, we are in pretty constant contact with those consulates, giving them information, answering information if they're asking questions of us. And the employment contracts are reviewed on an annual basis by all stakeholders. It is reviewed at a nation-to-nation meeting. So the Canadian government and the sending governments or the source governments meet together. Those contracts for SOP are also signed by the employer, the employee, and the source country. So it's a 3-way contract. Other programs that are used, particularly in our industry, if someone wants to help with a pathway to permanency, can be the temporary foreign worker agricultural stream. And that allows employers to hire TFWs for a maximum period of 24 months, during which time often, if it works out between employer and employee, that is when they will start in on their pathway to permanency. The production must be in specific commodity sectors that are on the national commodity list, and the activity must be solely related to on-farm primary agriculture. There are other farms, such as greens and oilseeds, that don't have crops on the national commodity list that must use the low wage stream of the temporary foreign workers programs. Some of the challenges that we have been working on is trying to create and maintain an ongoing collaboration with government officials and industry partners to address the chronic labor shortages. A lot of pandemic related travel requirements and other pandemic requirements, new rules for housing, new rules for how people were coming in, health and safety rules. There were a lot of new things coming in due to the pandemic. Addressing backlogs of LMIA applications, particularly in the ag stream, but also last year there was a snafu, I guess, at ESDC, and they transferred everything over onto a new server. And there was some kind of a loop created where everything backed up for weeks and months. And also addressing the complicated housing and program requirements from all levels of government, because all levels of government have input into our program. Fruit and veg growers is a conduit of information up and down the chain. We disperse information received from the government to all our groups. We pass information up to the government from employers that we receive, hopefully in a way to resolve sticking points. Sometimes there are unintended consequences, and we have to let people know that, you know, this really isn't working. There is a good goal. How can we make this work? Maintaining the integrity and viability of the programs through education on employer responsibilities, and continuing to help our growers and also the government understand how things are going on the ground. We know that there are all kinds of audits that we do. There are integrity audits, TFW programs. I believe their goal is to audit a third of all employers every year. So that means we are having integrity audits based on the contracts that we sign. Growers are also have a lot of other audits that they perform, and we just want to make sure everybody is well informed, knows what their responsibilities are, and that they can meet those responsibilities. And yes, I think I'm going to just try and touch on a few things perhaps that Ed brought up. I know certainly here in Manitoba, the unemployment rate is really low, as it is all across the country. Trying to find someone who wants these jobs is very, very difficult. And I truly wish that we could pay people more, but the corollary to that is Canadians would have to be willing to pay more for their food. And we are already on not just a local market. We are selling at a national level, but we are in competition with other countries like Mexico, Peru, the United States, but in particular other countries where sometimes what would be our hourly rate is their daily rate of pay down there. So it makes it very difficult to maintain profitability in our industry. The last few years have been very difficult trying to get employees from anywhere, even from the source countries we normally deal with because of COVID restrictions and because of problems within countries trying to just do the paperwork. It's been very difficult the last few years. So I would say there is a very definite and proven shortage of workers for horticulture in Canada. And the evolution may have come one way or another, but where we stand today is the fact that we cannot get workers to come to work on the farm. I'm really looking forward to any questions anyone has, and I will leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you, Beth. That was great. I appreciate that. And Dr. Dunsworth also for your presentation. So before we get on to the discussion section, there's just going to be one more quick poll for our participants. It's just popped up, but I'll read it out loud. Based on what you've heard today, how well do current policies support workers in the Canadian agri-food system? You have a Likert scale, so all the way from very well to acceptable to very poor. If you take a minute to answer your interpretation of that, we'll share the results. Okay, so a bit of a good distribution here. Based on what you've heard today, how well do current policies support workers in the Canadian agri-food system? 0% said very well, 14% said well, 17% said acceptable, kind of in the middle, 55% said poor, and 14% said very poor. So again, it does reflect that maybe you have a bit of room to make some improvements, as is always the case, and some differences in perspectives. So one of the quick questions that came up, and this could just be sort of an aside for Ed before we get into the discussion, is one of the participants said, very interesting research, just wondering why the researcher picked the tobacco sector from the other agricultural sectors.
Yeah, thanks for the question. The real reason is just by accident. I fell into it, as is often the case of with research projects. But after falling into it, why I stuck with it, a big part of it had to do with the fact that tobacco is like the key destination for migrant workers for a lot of the 20th century. So that seemed to make it a good way to focus in a longer term study of farm labor in Canada and migrant farm labor in Canada. So I sort of decided doing this book, which started out as a PhD dissertation. I was interested in the seasonal agricultural workers program. That's where it started. But I decided I wanted to put that within a longer context and going back even a few decades before that, and looking at the longer history of farm labor and migrant farm labor in Canada. So tobacco as this really huge destination just kind of emerged as a very interesting case study that I fell into, but was happy to stick with.
Thank you. That's great. So we are getting quite a few questions pop up. I have a couple of my own just in case we need to do it, but I feel like we're going to cover some of those topics through our discussion here. So I'll just do this a little bit, sort of first come, first serve. When workers are expected to contribute to agricultural labor, are there limits to skills and languages that are in effect? So this might be speaking to some of the barriers on workers or facing workers when they try and get into these roles. I don't know, maybe Beth, maybe you could speak to that one if you had some experience.
Some barriers. Well, on our farm, we speak English, we have high school French, and we also have a little bit of Spanish. We also have workers who speak Spanish and pretty good English. So we have a lot of that going on. We have had other immigrant populations try and come through. It does make it more difficult if it's hard to communicate expectations, and particularly we worry about expectations around safety. So we have a lot of signage that is symbolism, but we do have difficulty with that if we're bringing in someone from some other location like Africa or Iran or Iraq, or we've had all kinds of different people come through the farm. In general, if we're working through the program, we have the ability to manage that kind of stuff. Through our Caribbean workers, it's English that we speak. All of our guys are from Jamaica. With Mexico, we have some basic Spanish, and we also do a lot of work on WhatsApp and translation that kind of stuff, to be clear that to everyone that what's needed, what's safe, and that kind of stuff, and also a lot of symbols. I think that's, if I understood the question properly, that's what I would say.
No, that's great. I appreciate that there are going to be some challenges, and obviously it's good to have some things in the toolkit to help with that communication exchange. Okay, the next one is a question for Ed specifically. Regardless of how we use the TFW programs, does your research suggest that today the ag industry can meet labor demands without the TFW program? And then I would maybe add on a little piece extra if there was room for improvement in there, or pieces that you could keep or change, and maybe you could speak to that also.
Great, thanks for the question, Jennifer. Yeah, I think like one thing I wanted to say that I cut in the interest of time is that I think like really what's happened here is that growers with the cooperation of the government have essentially created a segmented labor market. So they've kind of exempted themselves from a free labor market. So in a free market, including a free labor market, you have to offer your goods at competitive wages and be able to pay at competitive prices and be able to pay the prices required to purchase goods. So it's no different for labor. If you want to attract labor on the free market, you have to offer competitive wages. But what these programs have allowed growers to do is kind of exempt themselves from a free market. So they're in an artificially segmented labor market where they're able to get highly skilled, experienced, quite constrained by their contracts, workers from the global south to do these jobs, and all for the bargain basement price of minimum wage plus costs. So with that situation, of course you can't get Canadian workers to compete with that. It's ludicrous to think that Canadian workers with skills and determination and so on would travel to rural places and do these jobs for minimum wage. It's completely out of keeping with any concept of a free labor market. So I think it's really important to realize that. I think that's kind of like what's happened here. In terms of where we go from here, like as I said, I don't want to make a moral attack on farmers. Like they're acting as shrewd, rational, self-interested business people, which is what business people are going to do. It's silly to expect kind of self-sacrificing behavior any more than it would be to expect that from, the owner of Walmart or Rogers or whatever. Business people aren't going to do that. So where we go from here, really, I think for me, it's a question more for the state, the government, public policy. Can agriculture happen without temporary farm workers? Of course it can, but it would require a radical shift in how we organize our agricultural systems. We'd have to organize things in a way where workers could be paid competitive wages, and for produce to still be competitively priced at that point. Obviously, that would involve some protectionism. That opens up the whole question of free trade. So it's a very difficult public policy question if you want to tackle it. And there seems to be zero political appetite to tackle it. So is a major change going to happen? Not on the immediate horizon. But of course, it's possible to have Canadian agriculture without temporary farm workers. The situation we're in, like any historical situation, is the product of human choices. But I think it's important to understand like how we got here, and to understand like the situation for what it is, which is it's an artificial segmented labor market. It's operating outside of a free labor market. Whether you support it or not, that's fine. But it's important to recognize what it is and have some sense of the history of how we got here. Yeah, so I guess I'll leave it at that.
I appreciate that. I think that this is one of those issues with trying to pull a string out of a pretty wicked, complex problem. You'll find that the string's attached to a million other strings, obviously. So in the comments, there's a researcher that mentioned that they've reviewed research that shows wage increase have little to no impact in attracting workers to rural jobs in the ag sector, which is one part of the puzzle, I recognize. But also Beth was speaking about the seasonality of the work and some of the other things. There are challenges that are just beyond that. And then on the consumer side also, what would they be willing to support as far as price increases? So
Yeah.
It's a complex problem, which is why we have these discussions and try and piece it out, right?
Mhm. Yes, very complicated, and it goes all the way from food policy to all kinds of different societal issues.
Definitely. And one thing that came up for me that's reflected in one of these questions, so I'll just read the next question. Knowing farmers need more workers, why is it that some farm owners abuse TFWs not only verbally, but emotionally and sometimes physically? So we've heard stories of some unfortunate circumstances. And you know, based on some of the things that that Ed was suggesting, this might be a thing that they don't have a lot of agency in order to sort of speak or advocate for themselves. And so I'm sure this is something that you've at least heard about. Yes, of course.
Heard about.
Of course. And so,
yes, so I would say kick them out of the program is what I would do. No matter what industry you're in, no matter what group of society you're in, you're going to have bad apples. And we are perfectly happy to have people who are abusing workers, abusing the system, pulled out and set aside and said, you can't do this anymore. It is one reason why the integrity audits were instituted a number of years ago, and they go around. I sincerely hope that on all farms, workers feel able to talk up, not necessarily on their farm if they're feeling that way, but there are resources available to them, whether it is the hotline that the government has, whether it has the NGOs that the government is supporting fiscally, or whether it is simply going to your parish priest, which many of these guys talk with, and having it move forward that way. They should be reported.
that makes sense. Yeah. I'm going to jump just to one more question. We only have a couple minutes left, so I'll try and be a bit selective here. But again, it seems that these programs have some fairly onerous requirements on the part of the farmer. I think I heard audit about 17 times. How can changes be made? And I suppose in what sort of areas would you see that going?
It would be helpful if things were streamlined a little. The reality is those guardrails are there to protect employees and also employers. But we are audited in a number of ways. Employees have exactly the same rights as a Canadian employee. So, for example, in the last year, we have had an integrity audit. Here in Manitoba, we've had an employment standards audit. We've had health and safety audits. We do an annual food safety audit. We've done a sustainability audit, which also has an employment and how you treat your employees component to it. So as producers of food here in Canada, we are heavily regulated. I think the best that we can expect is for there to be clear guidelines on what we are required to do so that we know exactly what we're supposed to be doing. And if those need to be managed over time to expand or contract on what issues are coming up or disappearing, that's fine. As long as it's well defined, we know what we're expected to do. We have these audits all the time. We just need to know what's expected. Simplifying the process would be wonderful. ESDC has just undertaken to reorganize the programs into one consolidated group. And the other thing that we're embarking on is a discussion on housing standards that we hope will be able to spread right across the country. There is a national standard right now, but there are also many provincial standards. And some of those standards go right down to a local level with the local health group making rules. So it makes it really complicated to comply. Trying to find a common ground on everything can be difficult in a group like Canada, because we have independent provinces who have independent rules for a lot of the things that we do on a daily basis.
That's great. Thank you. We're down to our last minute here, so I'll just see if there's maybe 10 or 20 second takeaway or last comments from each of you. Maybe we can start with Ed.
Thank you. I don't know what I would say for 10-second takeaway other than to thank you very much. Yeah, and I'll plug my book again if people want to read more.
Great, thanks, Ed. Beth?
I would say thank you to everyone. Excellent questions. There was one more in there about percentage of people who wanted permanent residency on our farm. And to our knowledge, nobody really has brought it up in an ongoing basis. We've had a very low percentage, and I have a whole range of people here on the farm. I have a new guy who came this year who is talking about his 4-year plan on working 4 summers, and then he's going home and he's got a business plan at home for what he's going to do. And I also have a worker who said this year, this is the year that I want to get all of the paperwork done for my CPP so that I can take it home with me and I can decide over the winter whether I want to come back next year or apply for my CPP. So we've got full ranges of people here in our farm at any least, and on all farms, who come year after year and they want to go home. I think over the years, we've probably helped 4, maybe 5 employees attain their permanent residency here in Manitoba.
Well, I want to thank our panelists again, Beth and Ed. This has been a really great discussion. I've learned a lot. I hope that our attendees have also. I want to thank the communication and events team of the School of Public Policy for all their support. And again, I want to thank our sponsors for the event. So that's UFA and the RCF. And thank you very much. And just a final reminder that there'll be a follow-up email, including a link to the recording. And probably by next week, this will be posted. So if anybody wants to share it or view it again, please follow us there. And thanks again for joining us today at the Simpson Center Public Education Webinar Series. Have a great day.